All right, so I really want to be respectful of everyone's time. So I'm gonna make a commitment that I'm not gonna use the full 54 minutes that I have, and I'll be done before. I think I can get it into 30 minutes. Only if you don't ask any questions. How about that? Okay. It's up to you. Okay. I'm sorry? Or make any statements. Or maybe it depends. Okay, so just to kind of re-establish what we're looking at here, for those of you who didn't have a chance to come last week. So this book, Putting on the Heart of Christ, was a gift from Father Marcelino during the exercises that we did in October. And there was a few of us that were at those exercises that are here. 1, 2, 3, 4, at least 4 of us. That during the meals and the exercises where we like to feed our bodies and also feed our minds. So this was the book that Marcelino lent us. The first meal we actually had was Dead Silence, which wasn't bad, but some of us kind of missed the book, and Marcelino lent us this one. And by the time we got to the end of the exercises, since I was the campanero, at least half the people there asked me, where I got the book, and can they take a picture of the book, and I want to learn more about the book. And there was enough interest that I just, we decided as a consejo, why don't we just look at it, bring it here to the Círculo, and kind of transmit it to the group. So that's kind of where this was born, so we could thank Father Marcelino. In his words, the book was crema de la crema. And kind of what it looks at is taking the exercises and some of the teachings of St. Ignatius, looking at it through the lens of virtues, right? Through what he refers to as virtue ethics, and then trying to see how to translate that to our daily lives. And it's an interesting way to look at it that a lot of us found very fruitful. Oh, you were there too, so it was at least 5 of us that were there. Yeah, 1, 2, 3, 4. Part of the challenge that he puts on us in looking at the exercises is it's not just for decision making, or not just answering the question of what does God want me to do by way of action, but he takes it a little bit deeper into who does God want me to become. And then through becoming that person and leading a virtuous life, then we transmit through our actions. So just to kind of put it in context. So the 2 chapters that I'm going to focus on, one was a little bit too short for this purpose in a Círculo. 3 was a little bit too long, so we said, okay, 2 should work just about right. We'll see how it goes. And these are the 2 that I'm going to be focusing on. The reverence created in love is chapter 2 is based on Ignatian teachings of principle and foundation. That's kind of the focus by way of the exercises, looking at reverence. And on chapter 3, looking at the virtue of gratitude, all is a gift. The focus is on the Ignatian teachings of finding God in all things, which we've all heard and learned about. And we just heard in the first reading, right, about looking at the virtues and leading a virtuous life. So eventually we'll go through all of these, but these are the ones we're focusing on today. So reverence. The definition is a deep respect for someone or something. Reverence is related most closely to the virtues of humility and temperance. If it's not obvious as to why, it involves thinking of ourselves as the lesser, which is where the humility comes in. And it also takes a commitment and a lifestyle moderation, which is where the temperance comes in. So reverence kind of requires a blend of these other 2 virtues. We like to begin the exercises with a reflection on some basic truths, which we're going to look at on the next slide, the principle and foundation. And like I mentioned earlier, besides decision making And besides looking at, what is God's plan for me, the challenge in this book is thinking about who we can become through the virtues. He also challenges us to look at God as the origin and source of all creation, which we're going to get into a little deeper, and this blend of both majesty and mystery. And our response to that majesty and mystery is reverence. This Latin phrase, mysterium tremendum et fascinas, is the mystery that is daunting and majestic, yet fascinating. And we'll see some scriptural references where we can kind of see the blend of those two things. He invokes a lot of scripture throughout these. I don't know how many of you had a chance to read it. It's okay if you didn't. I think I tried to be sensitive to assuming most of us were not going to have a chance to read it and kind of summarize it, but also respectful to those that read it and try to give a different perspective and some personal testimony to not just redact what you already read. At the end of the day, every religion does have some reverence to the ultimate. So this is almost like a foundational principle of religion, right? Is reverence is part of it. So looking at principle and foundation as a baseline for reverence. I'm not going to read it to you. You guys all know how to read. But we've seen this many times in the exercises, and this is obviously important in the teachings of St. Ignatius. I just highlighted a few of the phrases that I thought were relevant in the discussion of reverence, where, our purpose, right? Man is created to praise, reverence, and to serve God. It's also important to remember that all other things on the face of the earth are created for man to fulfill that purpose, right? So it starts to put it in perspective, looking outward. And then this asks us to make ourselves indifferent to all created things, but at the same time respect the gifts from God. So outside of that first phrase, and I think this is hard for some of us in our daily lives to live by, 24/7, 365, but everything else is almost meaningless if it's not in somehow connected to that first sentence. So this principle and foundation is meant to evoke a religious experience. It's not meant to be a purely intellectual or philosophical discussion, right, or statement of fact, but rather it's meant to also touch our hearts and to impact how we perceive not just our own lives, but also everything that's around us, which is part of where reverence and then in turn, which we'll study later, gratitude stems from. So as we consider the virtue of reverence, it's important that we try as best we can to understand the depth of God's love for us. He talks about the concept of creation, where beginning at conception, creation is a continual process. It's not a one and done. It's not a gift that was given to us and now we are responsible for our own lives. Rather, it is a daily, day by day, hour by hour, minute by minute. It is a continual process where God is continuing to create. He mentions things like each time we have the opportunity to breathe in air, each time that our heart takes the next beat, that is God's creation of our continuance, right? Pretty interesting concept that I had not really thought much prior to reading this. I think sometimes even we as Catholics misinterpret creation as I created you and now you go do your own thing. God is continually deciding to create us day by day, minute by minute, right, along with all the gifts that he is giving to us every day, every moment of our lives. And obviously we have a tendency to take a lot of that for granted, which we'll get into in the next chapter. But that continuation, he references, and I think this came out of the next chapter, but he references G.K. Chesterton talking about taking for granted that the sun is going to rise tomorrow. And he elicits a concept where it is God's decision tomorrow to allow the sun to rise for the ones that he loves, right? It is not something that is owed to us or something we have any right to expect, but rather it is a continual decision on God's part to keep giving us those gifts, right? So as we consider the depth of God's love, it's important we think about it as something radical and unconditional. God took, this is from the book, God took the initiative to love us long before we were able to love in return. And we do not need to win God's love. I think sometimes we feel that we have to earn God's love. It is so ever-present, it is so radical and so unconditional that independent of our response to his love, it still exists. It is, in its purest form, it is a perfect gift that calls for a pure response on our part. And that's where the ask of the virtues come in. St. Ignatius asks us to try to understand this, not just in our heads, but also in our hearts. And that's on the first bullet, asking for principle and foundation to elicit a personal religious experience, not just thinking about it on an intellectual level. There's a couple phrases from Isaiah that he references here that I wanted to read that kind of talk about the depths of God's love. He says, I have called you by name and you are mine, because you are precious in my sight, and I honored and loved you. And in another different chapter of Isaiah, he asks the question, can a woman forget her nursing child or show no compassion for the child of her womb? Even these may forget, yet I will not forget you. As you can see, I have inscribed you on the palm of my hands. So this scriptural reference to the depth of God's love. So he mentions also that a person cannot come to honest self-knowledge without first knowing they are loved, right? How often in our daily lives do we really believe and operate according to these principles about how radical and unconditional God's love is for us? I think sometimes he mentions looking at a demanding God versus a loving God, right? And responding to that side. Corey, go do your homework. Take off your hat. I think sometimes we think that God expects more of us than we are capable of, right? So, that has a tendency for us to feel like we have to work specifically to get the love from God that he is already giving to us in abundance. And he challenges us to see it for what it is. So going back to the concept of majesty and mystery together, he cites several examples in Scripture, and I won't read all of these, but example of Abraham dropping to the ground, Moses removing his shoes and covering his face, Peter who falls to his knees after the catch of the fish. After the transfiguration, they were blinded by the light and then fell prostrate and were afraid. And on all of these, it kind of relates to a paradox of both awe of God's love, but at the same time of fear, right? And that's kind of where the majesty and the mystery come together. And he relates that back to reverence as an invitation to draw towards that God that we can become afraid of. And that's where reverence comes in. It's that union of both awe and fear. And if you guys remember, Father Willie, some of the sayings he had, I think for the school, about running to the fire and be not afraid, right? Those are some of the things that I was remembering reading through this part. So this gets into a concept of self-transcendence, right? And this is thinking about who God is asking me to become, not just what can I do. And I think we all have a natural desire to change. I think just by virtue of the fact that we're human beings, right? Philosophically, being implies change, implies movement, right? We're not static. So we're either moving towards or moving away from God. We're never in that same position. And this reverence is a desire to change, and it's what pulls us towards our Creator. Sometimes desiring I know not what, and this is where that awe and that mystery of God, even though we don't fully understand Him, we're still drawn towards Him, and that's where reverence plays a part. So here's looking at Saint Ignatius' view on reverence. Some of this is from the exercises. He talks about the awe, fascination, respect, and place. He looks at, he mentions an awe, which is affectionate, reverencia y acatamiento are the terms that he uses. In those two parts of the exercises on 75, he counsels other people to pray with an act of reverence or humility before engaging into prayer. And this is now kind of starting to look at, okay, how do we practice the virtue of reverence in our lives? In part 3 of the exercises, he asks that when we are conversing with God or the saints, greater reverence is demanded of us than when we are using the intellect to understand. So just a couple of examples of where Ignatius refers to reverence. During the contemplation on divine love, which is closer to the end of the exercises, he asks us to understand and interpret a sense of God's active and continued presence in our lives, right? And this goes back to his undying love. And St. Ignatius is often referred to as a contemplative in action, right? The contemplation part of continually finding God in all things, right? Having that reverence for God, but at the same time acting upon that love, and that's what we're called to do. So, looking at reverence in our lives, how do we go put this into action? Well, examination of conscience, which is very Ignatian practice, is a practice that helps foster this virtue. Why? Because it makes us more aware of how God is expressing Himself through His love in our daily lives. And when we did a good job interpreting it, and also when we did a good job or a bad job by rejecting it or not seeing it for what it was. Living reverently is an attitude, right? It's a disposition of heart. It's not something that happens for a moment in time. It's not something that we say, okay, I was reverent during prayer, and now the reverence run away, right? It's a continued disposition of heart, of how we interpret. It also calls us to look for a fulfillment beyond ourselves. He asks us to use moments of awe to tap into reverence in our lives in spite of the busyness, right? We all have excuses about why I couldn't be reverent on this day at this time, but it doesn't matter what it is we're doing. Ignatius challenges us to practice reverence. It's almost a pair of glasses that allows us to find God in all things, which is a good segue to the next chapter, right? It's how we interpret the world around us. When he mentions using moments of awe, he talks about, kind of like charging the battery that we can call on later. Things like like the birth of a child, beauty in nature, right? Sunrise, sunset, moments that we have that we just know, especially us in this room as Catholics, right? I have no doubt that this is God showing me, His love in my life just for a brief moment. Maybe when no one else is around, no one else gets the opportunity to notice, right? You see a flower starting to sprout or whatever the case is. That was an example he gave. But just, soaking that in is an act of reverence in itself, knowing where it comes from. So he ends the chapter by inviting us to ask ourselves some of these questions, some of these reflections, and I'm not going to use the opportunity to talk about it because I want to get to the next chapter, but he asks us to recall an experience of reverence and awe in our own lives. Asks us, where and how do I currently experience God's presence in my life? How can I grow in reverence for God, for others, for myself, and for my life? And how can I foster a contemplative heart? So these are kind of some of the questions that we're challenged to reflect on as we think about reverence. Okay, moving to chapter 3, looking at gratitude. So, and this relates to Ignatian principles of finding God in all things. So gratitude is the quality of being thankful and readiness to show appreciation for and to return kindness. And the reason I underline those two words is because they both imply some action. So gratitude is not just a feeling or a way of interpreting, but rather it's a noun, but the two verbs in the definition of showing appreciation and to return kindness imply an outward expression of the one who is feeling gratitude, right? And I think that's important. Looking at it, defining it from an antithetical perspective, Ignatius refers to ingratitude as the greatest sin and the source of all sins. It's a big statement. I read that and I paused for a second. I thought, man, that's kind of deep, right? It's a little strong. And the more I thought about it, the more I reflected on it, the way he talks about it is when we are when we do not have that gratitude or we are expressing ingratitude towards God, is only when we are not prepared and ready, willing, able to return to God the kindness for all His graces. And only then are we capable of sinning, right? Because if we do not clearly recognize and interpret everything that's around us as a gift from God, which it is, then is the only time that we allow ourselves to sin. So Ignatius proposes that ingratitude is what allows sin to enter our lives. It's the source of sin. Gratitude also is an acknowledgement of not just the gift, but also the giver. I'm going to go into that a little bit more later. I talked before about creation being a continuous gift. Going back to the gift versus the giver, he talks about we run the risk that if we forget about the giver, we run the risk of treating the gift as a possession, where you gave me a gift, now I see it as mine, and I forget where it came from, that it was an expression of love from you to me. And I forget about the fact that you gave it to me, and now I see this gift as mine, as a possession of my own, that I am now responsible for. And that's the wrong way to look at it, especially when we're talking about gifts from God, right, which is everything around us. If we forget where it comes from, we run the risk of taking dominion over that possession, right, versus seeing it for what it truly is. So it's both the gift and the giver. I'll talk about that some more later. There was a song, maybe people in my generation will remember this from Cinderella, the band Cinderella. You don't know what you got till it's gone. Sometimes we're not grateful for something or don't experience the gratitude for something we had in our lives until we no longer have it. And unfortunately, sometimes that's what it takes. He talks about we have a tendency to experience gratitude sporadically. And we're good at recognizing God maybe at certain times for certain things, but the graces of God and the gifts from God are continual and abundant. And this virtue is asking us to see it everywhere all the time. And that's kind of where the challenge comes in. Not just when it's convenient or obvious. So here are some Ignatian references to gratitude in the Principle and Foundation. He encourages the awareness of giftedness in our lives when he says, and all other things on the face of the earth are created for man to help him in that end. In other words, everything that's around us, everything we see is a gift from God to help us fulfill the end for which we were created. He also mentions St. Ignatius referencing Christians are those who see everything as a gift from God. He talks also about the experience in Manresa at the Rio Cardoner, which is, Ignatius talks about it as, in all the 60, he was 62 at the time when he had a vision. And in his words, there was one moment in time where if you added up all of everything he had learned about God and all the graces he had received his entire life until that moment did not add up to everything that he understood and received from God at that one moment. That's how much clarity, I think is a good word to describe it, he received at that experience in the Rio Cardoner. Another concept that comes up is exitus reditus. I don't know if some of you guys were around when Tony Lopez used this to kind of describe the Trinity. It's basically a concept of a procession and return is what the translation of that is. And that refers to the perfection of things consists in their return to the first principle from which they proceeded in the first place. Okay? The procession and the return. Tony talked about this for the Trinity. It's not why I reference it here, but he talked about the relationship between God the Father and God the Son as being a complete giving of oneself to the other, right? The exitus from the Father to the Son, and then from the Son giving himself wholly back to the Father is almost like a perfect love. Right, and then that bond was the Holy Spirit. That was Tony taught us about the Trinity. In this sense, that same concept, St. Ignatius looks at it in terms of creation and incarnation. And incarnation, not just looking at the incarnation itself, but the Paschal mystery, right? Where creation was that giving, and the incarnation and the Paschal mystery is that return. And that's how. That procession and return is the perfection of God's love, right? Kind of like the coming full circle. And it's important because he relates this back to gratitude of when he gives, it's our gratitude that makes his love become more perfect. Okay? That make sense? Okay. So that results in the immense feeling of gratitude. The creation incarnation, how do I get down here? So, kind of looking at it sequentially, he talks about being able to see God in our lives and understand that, everything around us is a gift from God, and finding God in all things and having that awareness is what drives us to be grateful for those things, right? That's what inspires gratitude in us. And the more we can work on that as a virtue, that promotes our love of God, and then our desire to serve, which is going back to Principle and Foundation. And then he talks about psychologically, this is clearly a source of happiness. This is where happiness comes from, right? That's the fulfillment. Okay? So kind of one leads to the other in somewhat of a domino effect. I want to put a couple pictures up just to not make it all words up here. I got another one coming up. But this is kind of the sequential order that St. Ignatius talks about where gratitude fits in. So some expressions of gratitude. He talks about, Hugo Reiner talks about a characteristic which distinguished the noble heart of Ignatius. It's the reason Ignatius kept his journal. He was jotting down not just the experiences he had to keep those memories alive, but also to remember the gratitude he had for those experiences at the moment which they happened, right? So it shows you how important gratitude was to Ignatius. It even comes out in the constitutions of the Society of Jesus. Ignatius asks to pray, all Jesuits, to pray for the benefactors of the society and to offer them service directly. Shows you how important, again, being grateful, gratitude is. He talked about, he mentions in the book a letter to a benefactress where he says, "Our Lord insists that we look to the giver and love the giver more than the gift. Love the giver more than the gift. And thus keep the giver before our eyes and in the most intimate thoughts of our heart." Beautiful way to kind of put a priority on this, right? Is what gratitude is focused on. It's not focused on the gift so much as it is the giver. Gratitude is also a disposition of heart that notices, right? That's where the awareness comes in, and then remembers. And I think that's maybe we're a little bit more challenged on the latter than the former. And again, examination of conscience is a good way to kind of look back on our day and reflect on where, how, when, to what degree did God express his love to me. Who was she as a benefactress? It doesn't describe in the book what she did, other than the fact that she was a benefactress. So here's just a way of looking at it. And this is not perfect. I made this up. This wasn't in the book, but it's just kind of my way of describing a couple of concepts. The thing I want to focus on here is that the giver is larger than the gift. The giver is more important than the gift. The gift is almost a subset. It's a participation in the giver. Okay, that's kind of one thing I wanted to communicate here. Also, that gratitude calls us to have that focus and that awareness on the giver, like I mentioned on the last slide, more so than just the gift itself, right? Especially as we're talking about God. It's also a recognition that all good things come from the giver and that God is the giver, and these gifts are participations within him, almost a subset, right? The concept of participation that we've talked about here plenty. This also shows some feelings and sentiments that are incompatible with gratitude. If you are experiencing gratitude, you are incapable of pettiness, you're incapable of self-centeredness, you're incapable of negativism, right? These things don't align with the feeling and that disposition of gratitude. Something else is gratitude drives us to take those gifts that we receive and share them with others, okay? I just thought this was a better way of looking at it than putting it into words, but kind of all these concepts were things that he touches on in this chapter. So, end of the day, gratitude is a choice. This is some thoughts that I thought were key to kind of get the message. Even in moments of loss or of tragedy, right? I think maybe up until this point in the chapter, maybe we were all thinking of being grateful for all the things that even, in our more secular world, right, we have a tendency to be grateful for. But even in moments of loss or tragedy, we're called for gratitude. So the virtue of gratitude helps us break out of that role of victim and work towards healing. And it allows us to share in the suffering and to have that participation in the Paschal mystery. I something that came to mind when I was reading about this. I have when I visit the guys in jail, I do prison ministry. I talk to them about being grateful, right? They all some of these guys think they're the worst point in their lives, but I tell them, look, there is somebody out there who wishes they could trade with you right now, who doesn't have a bed to sleep in, who doesn't have food to eat, who can't walk, who can't see, or all of the above. I think we are challenged to be grateful even in periods of tragedy or of suffering. Something that happened in my life a long time ago. I suffered from a brain tumor. Everything was fine immediately after I found out, or I shouldn't say immediately. It took a surgery and a few things. But while that was going on, I remember, through the grace of God, I remember experiencing very clearly a feeling of gratitude for being able to share, even if it was just a little piece, of the suffering that Christ had for us, right? And that giving of self. I always felt God doesn't give you anything you're not ready to handle. And I thought, wow, how does he think so much of me that he thinks I can handle this? I felt almost, honored, right? Which for somebody who's not Catholic was a little harder to understand. But I'm sure you guys could appreciate it. And it was being grateful for that sharing. People have a tendency to come together through shared experiences, right? Some of the people we're closest to in our lives, it's because we had experiences in common. And when we can have, even if it's a small, infinitesimal percentage of the suffering that Christ had, we should see that as an opportunity, right? And be grateful for sharing and participating in his suffering. So it's not just focusing on gratitude for the good things in our life, but also for that suffering. Okay, I think that's a challenge that we're all faced with. Also, a calling to accept what has happened in hope, and that's where we talked about gratitude being the ability to notice and to remember our gifts, so that we can then accept everything as part of that greater purpose and the end for which we were created. Big picture. Okay, it kind of puts it all in perspective. In Job, this is a part where he talks about, trying to find my notes here. Eric, come over here for a second. How do I get to, oh, there we go, never mind. Yeah. So, just to read real quick, it's only a couple verses. At this, Job got up and tore his robe, shaved his head, fell to the ground in worship, and said, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised." In all this, Job did not sin by charging God with wrongdoing. And so, just as our gifts sometimes are temporary, right? Especially when we have a loss in our lives. How often are we grateful for the time that we did have at the time of loss, right? Versus strictly focusing on the pain of the loss. And that's where, being able to practice the virtue of gratitude helps us through those times. There also exists a gift dimension in all reality. So, there's this all comes into the larger context. I mentioned before, there's a psychological connection to happiness, specifically because being grateful, not just to God, but to others in our lives helps build trust, helps cement relationships. It helps see things from a positive perspective versus from a negative perspective, and all of those things lead to psychological happiness as well. It's not a temporary state. It's not a response to a gift. We're not only grateful when we recognize. We're called to be grateful at all times, just like any virtue. This concept of stewardship of gifts in lieu of consumption, possession, or dominion, that goes to differentiating, focusing on between the giver and the gift, right? If I received a gift from you and I continue to see that gift as part of you and an expression of love from you to me, then I care for that gift. I don't see it now as my personal possession for my consumption to do with what I wish. I see it as almost I owe you, right, because of the love that you expressed for me, a responsibility to take care of that gift. And that's how we are called with all the gifts that we receive from God around us. Gratitude is not passive contentment. It's not just saying, okay, great, I'm happy with everything I have, and it ends there. It's a call to action, it's a call to service. Going back to the Ignatian idea of contemplative in action. And this is part of how we practice gratitude in our lives. A grateful heart is anxious to share the gifts received, right? And that was kind of that arrow I showed about expressing to others. If we are really, truly grateful for everything we've gotten in our lives, part of how we express that gratitude is to share the gifts we received with others. So he had this somewhere early in the chapter, a reference to it. I'm sure most of us have read it at some point in time. But I thought it was a good kind of culmination about thinking of the virtue of gratitude. So I'll take a quick moment to read it. Take, Lord, and receive all my liberty, my memory, my understanding, and my entire will. All that I have and possess, you have given all to me. To you, O Lord, I return it. All is yours. Dispose of it wholly according to your will. Give me only your love and your grace, for this is sufficient for me. So this kind of looks at that return, right? Coming full circle. And so this is my last slide. This is how he ends the chapter on some things he challenges us to think about as it relates to gratitude. Looking at the givers in our life, are there some people or things that we have taken for granted? Are there some people I need to thank? And then looking at the outward expression that gratitude plants in us, how do we share gifts that we have received?